Chapter 1. The Journey Begins. The sun was beginning its gentle descent over the hills of Galilee, casting long, golden shadows over the earth. The air was warm and quiet, tinged with the scent of lake water and wild grass. Along the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, a small crowd began to thin out, their faces still glowing from the words they had just heard. Jesus had spent the entire day teaching beside the water. From the edge of a boat anchored near the shore, he spoke in parables, stories of seeds, of light, of faith, and the kingdom of God. The people listened, some sitting in the grass, others standing in silence, hungry not just for food, but for meaning, for hope. The lake rippled gently beside them, echoing his voice as he taught with authority yet with such gentleness. Evening approached, and the light began to fade. The disciples, weary yet content, gathered near the boat as Jesus concluded his teaching. Their teacher's eyes, though kind, looked tired. He had healed many, spoken much, and moved many hearts that day. Seeing this, Peter approached him and asked softly, "Shall we find a place to rest, Master?" Jesus turned to them and said, "Let us go across to the other side." His voice was calm, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. The disciples nodded, understanding that the journey had not ended, but merely changed direction. Without delay, they began preparations to set sail. Several of them, Peter, James, and John, were seasoned fishermen, familiar with the moods of the lake. They moved with confidence, untying ropes, folding sails, securing supplies. The boat was modest in size, made of sturdy wood, shaped for fishing more than travel, but it had carried them before. As Jesus stepped into the boat, he looked back at the distant figures still lingering on the shore, some waving, others kneeling, all changed in some small way by his presence. He smiled faintly, then sat down near the stern, resting his back on a cushion, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The disciples climbed aboard and pushed off from the shore. The boat creaked as it met the open water, and soon, the familiar rhythm of the oars against the lake set the pace for their crossing. At first, the journey was peaceful. The Sea of Galilee shimmered under the early night sky, and the stars began to emerge, one by one. A cool breeze brushed their faces, and the gentle splash of water against the hull was soothing. Jesus, now lying down, closed his eyes and drifted into sleep. His chest rose and fell steadily, untouched by the motion of the boat or the sounds around him. The disciples whispered among themselves, still reflecting on the parables. Thomas questioned their meanings, while Andrew repeated one of the stories aloud. Even in quiet moments like this, they were learning, not just from his words, but from his presence. But far on the horizon, hidden beyond the hills, the wind was changing. Invisible currents began to stir, unnoticed by the men in the boat. The lake, so calm and trusting under the stars, was about to show its other face. And so, their journey across the water began, not just across the lake, but into a storm that would test not only their strength, but their faith. Chapter 2. Shadows over the water. The boat drifted steadily across the wide expanse of the Sea of Galilee. Above, the moon began to rise behind a thin veil of clouds, bathing the water in silver light. The stars, once crisp and bright, now seemed to flicker uncertainly. A stillness settled in, subtle but unsettling, like the pause between breaths before something changes. Peter, gripping the oar, glanced around. "Feels cooler than usual," he murmured to James, who sat beside him. James nodded, squinting toward the horizon. The winds picked up a bit too. John leaned over the edge of the boat, watching the water swirl below. "It's probably nothing. This lake breathes with the night." But Matthew, the former tax collector now turned follower, shifted uneasily. He wasn't used to boats, or water, for that matter. "How far do we have to go?" he asked, voice uncertain. "We're maybe halfway," said Andrew, checking their direction. "If the wind stays light, we'll reach the other shore before long." At the stern, Jesus remained asleep, his head resting gently on the cushion, his robe rustling softly in the breeze. His peace was unshaken, even as the world around them began to whisper warnings. The wind grew bolder. It rolled across the lake like a beast awakening from slumber. Ripples turned to waves, and the wooden boat, once cradled by calm, began to rock gently. The disciples noticed. Even the seasoned fishermen stopped their quiet conversations and tightened their grips on the oars. Thomas looked upward. "Those clouds weren't there earlier, were they?" he asked, pointing toward the west. The sky was thickening. The moonlight faded behind dark masses slowly gathering like an army on the march. "No," said Philip. "And they're moving fast." The first spray of cold water struck Nathanael's arm, followed by another, larger one across Peter's back. Lightning flashed far off in the distance. Not yet a threat, but no longer ignorable. "We should prepare," said Peter. "Tie down anything loose. Secure the nets." James rose, nodding. "We've seen storms come quickly here. It's not unusual. It'll pass." But inside, a gnawing worry was blooming. The lake was notorious for its sudden, violent storms. The geography of the surrounding hills and valleys could summon winds that struck without warning, churning the peaceful waters into a chaotic sea. The boat heaved again, this time more violently. Jesus shifted slightly in his sleep but did not wake. Matthew clutched the side of the boat. "Should we wake him?" he asked, almost ashamed to speak it. "Not yet," Peter answered. "Let him rest. We can manage." But even as he spoke, the first gust of real wind slammed into the sail, snapping it taut like a drumbeat of war. The mast groaned, the ropes trembled, and the boat tilted sharply. Cries of surprise rang out from several of the disciples. Buckets of water sloshed into the boat. Andrew and Bartholomew scrambled to scoop it out. "We're taking on too much," cried Andrew, panic beginning to edge into his voice. The wind howled now, fierce and unrelenting. Thunder rolled overhead like a voice shouting in anger. The waves, no longer gentle, began to rise, towering, tumbling masses of water crashing against the hull. The small fishing boat bucked and lurched, creaking like a living thing in distress. Peter called out, his voice nearly lost in the wind, "Steady! Keep her into the waves!" But even as they fought to stay upright, the storm grew stronger. The boat began to fill faster than they could bail. Fear spread among them like wildfire. Still, Jesus slept. And this is what began to shake them most. Not the storm, not the danger, but that their master, the one they had left everything to follow, lay silent and still in the midst of such chaos. Was he unaware? Did he not care? Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the soaked and frightened faces of the disciples. In that flash, they saw their powerlessness. Their experience as fishermen, their strength, their knowledge, all of it was useless now. The lake was too strong. The storm was too great. And so, at last, they did what only desperation could teach them to do. They turned to the one who had never shown fear. They turned to Jesus. Chapter 3. The Cry for Help. Rain now fell in heavy sheets, slicing through the darkness like cold knives. It stung their faces, soaked their robes, and mixed with the spray of the crashing waves. The boat shuddered and groaned under the weight of water and wind, it seems crying out with every violent lurch. The air was filled with shouts, splashes, and the dull roar of thunder above them. The disciples were no longer speaking calmly. Their voices were raised in fear, sometimes in frustration, sometimes in desperate prayer. Even the seasoned fishermen among them, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, could see it now. This storm was different. It was fierce, relentless, almost sentient, and they were no match for it. "Get the water out!" Thomas cried, struggling with a half-filled bucket. "It's no use," shouted Philip. "We're sinking." The boat dipped as another wave smashed over the side, drenching them to the bone. The mast creaked dangerously, and ropes snapped like whips in the wind. The disciples clung to the sides of the vessel, to each other, anything to stay upright. Their hands were raw, their muscles strained, and still the storm raged on. And through it all, Jesus still slept. At the stern of the boat, curled against the wooden frame, Jesus lay as if untouched by the fury around him. The storm seemed to ignore him, as though the very chaos was afraid to wake him. His breath was steady, his face calm. There was no sign of worry, no fear. But the disciples were terrified. Peter stumbled toward him, grabbing hold of the side of the boat as it heaved again. "We're going to die out here," he shouted over the roar. James followed, his voice strained. "We need to wake him. Now." And so, together, soaked and shivering, they reached out and shook the sleeping figure. The wind howled louder, as if in protest. "Master!" Peter cried, his voice hoarse. "Master, don't you care that we're perishing?" The words cut through the night. They weren't just a plea, they were a challenge. A desperate accusation, born from the raw edge of fear. It was the voice of men who had seen miracles, followed teachings, witnessed wonders, but now found themselves drowning. Jesus stirred. Slowly, he sat up, the folds of his robe clinging to him with rain. His hair was wet, his face shadowed, but his eyes opened with a calm that pierced through the panic like a lighthouse through the fog. He looked first at the disciples. Then he turned his gaze to the storm. No words were spoken for a moment. Time seemed to pause. The wind still howled, the waves still climbed, but in the presence of Jesus now awake, something unseen shifted. He rose to his feet, steady despite the rocking of the boat, and stepped forward. His eyes did not flinch from the black skies or the raging waters. And then he spoke. Not in a shout, not with force, but with authority that needed no volume. "Peace," he said. "Be still." His voice, though quiet, carried with impossible weight. It reached past the wind, beyond the storm, into the very heart of the elements. It was not just a command, it was a declaration of sovereignty over creation itself. And immediately, the storm obeyed. The wind ceased. The waves fell. The clouds scattered. The silence that followed was as deafening as the storm before it. The boat, once thrown about like driftwood, now floated gently on a sea as smooth as glass. The rain stopped mid-fall, dripping softly from sails and shoulders. The moon reappeared overhead, casting its silver light once more, and the stars returned to their place in the sky, bright and still. The disciples stood frozen, soaked and breathless, staring not at the sky, but at him. Jesus turned to them. His expression was not angry. It was gentle, but searching. He asked one simple question. "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" His words, though soft, landed with the weight of truth. The disciples said nothing. They could not. Their hearts were pounding, not from the storm, but from what they had just witnessed. He had spoken to the storm, and it had listened. Who was this man? Even the wind and the sea obeyed him. They had seen him heal the sick, cast out demons, preach with power. But this was something more. This was the voice of God echoing through human lips. They looked at one another, eyes wide, and awe settled over them like a fresh wind, gentler, deeper than the fear that had held them moments ago. They were not just following a rabbi. They were in the presence of the divine. Chapter 4. The stillness after the storm. The boat drifted quietly on the now serene waters of the Sea of Galilee. The chaos was gone, yet something lingered in the silence. Something holy. The air no longer carried the sting of salt and rain, but a stillness so deep it made the disciples speak in whispers, as if raising their voices would break it. None of them dared move at first. They looked at each other, drenched, trembling, hearts still pounding not from fear, but reverence. A few of them sat slowly, gripping the sides of the boat, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Only moments ago, death had seemed inevitable. And now, all around them, peace. Not just calmness of weather, but peace that touched something deep in the soul. Peter, still holding on to the side of the boat, glanced at Jesus again. Jesus stood at the bow, eyes scanning the horizon, robes flowing gently in the light breeze. He seemed unshaken, as if the storm had never happened. The others followed Peter's gaze. It wasn't the first time Jesus had performed something miraculous. They had seen water turned into wine, the sick healed with a word, demons cast out by a simple command. But this was something different. Nature itself had obeyed him. The wind, the waves, the rain, they had responded like obedient servants to the voice of their master. And that left the disciples with a deeper, more unsettling question. Who is this man, really? Andrew finally broke the silence. "Did you see it?" he whispered. He spoke, and it stopped. James nodded slowly. Not just stopped. It obeyed. Bartholomew sat down beside Matthew, wiping rain from his brow. "We feared for our lives." And he was sleeping. "He wasn't afraid," murmured Thomas, the disbelief clear in his voice. "Not even for a second." Philip leaned against the mast, his eyes still wide. Even the sea listens to him. For a while, none of them said anything else. Their words felt small in light of what they had just witnessed. Jesus sat again, calmly looking at each of them. He didn't scold them. He didn't shake his head or sigh in frustration. But his earlier words echoed in their minds. "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The question didn't sound like rebuke. It was a call, an invitation to trust. It was as though he was asking, "After all you've seen, do you still think you're alone in the storm?" Peter closed his eyes for a moment. His mind returned to the towering waves, the cold fear in his gut, and then the voice, "Peace. Be still." And not just the sea had listened. Something inside Peter had calmed, too. He realized now, Jesus hadn't just calmed the storm around them. He had calmed the storm within them. The sky above began to clear completely. The stars twinkled more brightly now, and a soft silver glow shimmered across the surface of the water. The disciples began to bail out the remaining water from the boat, slowly and silently, still processing everything. Even the creak of the wood under their feet seemed gentler now, as though the boat itself had been changed by the presence of that divine voice. John, always the one to think deeply, finally spoke. Maybe the storm was never just about the sea. Maybe it was about us. Jesus looked over at him, eyes soft. John continued, his voice thoughtful. Maybe he wanted us to see that even when the waves rise, even when it feels like we're going under, we are never outside his care. Jesus didn't respond with words. But his gaze met John's for a moment, and in that glance, there was something profound. Approval, perhaps, or the quiet confirmation of truth. The disciples began to breathe more freely, a weight lifting from their chests. A different kind of fear had replaced the panic. Holy fear, the awe of standing near someone not just sent by God, but somehow one with God. They looked at Jesus and began to understand. Not fully, not yet. But something in them had shifted. Their hearts, like the sea, were starting to settle. They didn't just follow a miracle worker. They followed a master who had authority over heaven and earth, and hearts. And as the boat gently made its way across the calm water toward the distant shore, they sat closer together, no longer concerned about the storm they had left behind. The storm was over, but the lesson had just begun. Chapter 5. The Shore of Reflection. The boat glided gently toward the far shore, its bow cutting through the calm water like a brushstroke on still canvas. The wind had softened to a warm whisper, carrying the scent of wet wood, lake reeds, and morning mist. The sun had begun its slow rise over the distant hills, casting a golden hue across the Sea of Galilee and bathing the disciples in soft light. No one spoke for a long while. Each man sat in quiet thought, wrapped in his own silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon, or on Jesus. Something about that night had changed them. Not just the miracle they had witnessed, but the intimacy of it. The way their fear had been met not with frustration, but with peace. The storm had been terrifying, yes, but it had also been revealing. It had shown them their limits, their fears, their desperation. But even more, it had shown them Jesus, not just as a wise teacher or a compassionate healer, but as someone who spoke and the universe listened. As the boat nudged gently against the rocky shoreline, the wood scraping softly, Jesus stood and stepped out first. He helped the others steady the boat as one by one, they climbed onto solid ground. The earth beneath their feet felt strangely foreign after the long, trembling ride. Peter lingered a moment, staring out at the vast expanse of water they had just crossed. It was hard to believe it had been so violent only hours ago. Jesus walked a few steps up a grassy hill and sat beneath a fig tree, the early morning sun filtering through the leaves above him. The disciples followed, settling into the grass, wet robes clinging to their knees, their faces marked by both exhaustion and wonder. Jesus didn't speak right away. He simply sat with them, present, grounded, peaceful. It was John who broke the silence first. "I thought we were going to die." Jesus looked at him gently, saying nothing, waiting for more. John continued. "When the storm hit, it was like all the things we believed just fell apart. The fear was louder than our faith." Jesus nodded slowly. "Fear does that. Clouds vision. But it doesn't mean faith is gone. It means it needs to grow." James leaned back on his hands. "But how do we do that? How do we have faith in the middle of a storm?" Jesus turned toward him. "You don't wait for peace to have faith. You choose to trust before the peace comes. That's what real faith is. It's believing in what you can't yet see. It's knowing who is in the boat with you. There was silence again. The words settled on them like dew. Matthew stared at the horizon. I thought, because you were asleep, you didn't care. That you'd left us. Jesus smiled faintly. I was never gone. I was always with you. Even asleep, I knew the storm wouldn't destroy us. Thomas spoke hesitantly. But why allow the storm at all? Why let us go through that? Jesus paused, then answered, because the storm revealed your hearts, and it showed you mine. That truth hit hard and deep. They weren't the same men who had stepped into the boat the day before. They had begun that journey full of excitement, confident in their strength, bold in their loyalty. But the storm had stripped them of illusion. It had laid bare their weaknesses, their doubts, their need. And in that space of fear and helplessness, Jesus had revealed himself not just as Savior, but as Sovereign. Bartholomew plucked a blade of grass and rolled it between his fingers. You knew it would happen, didn't you? The storm. Jesus looked at him. Yes. And you let it come? Jesus nodded. I let it come, so you could see that even the winds and the waves obey me. There was no pride in his tone, only love. Gentle, patient love. Philip's voice was soft. I don't think I'll ever look at storms the same way again. Jesus said, that is the beginning of wisdom. Peter stood and took a few steps down the hill, staring once more at the calm waters. The wind toyed with his hair, now dry. He turned to Jesus, his voice low. I was angry that you slept, that you didn't stop it sooner. Jesus walked over to him, placed a hand on his shoulder. And now, Peter swallowed. Now I see, you didn't stop it because you were letting us see something more. Not just what you can do, but who you are. A quiet breeze swept through the trees. Jesus said, storms will come again. But next time, remember this. The storm is not stronger than the one who is with you. The disciples let that truth sink deep. It was no longer just a lesson. It was a memory etched into them, a moment of terror turned into transformation. Andrew looked up, smiling for the first time that morning. We'll tell others, won't we? About what happened. Jesus nodded. One day, yes. You'll tell the world. Not just about what I did, but about the peace I bring in every storm. And with that, he began walking down the path toward the nearby villages, the morning sun lighting his way. The disciples followed, not with the same uncertain steps as before, but with a steadier rhythm, one born from trust, from experience, from the peace that follows surrender. The storm had come, but the storm had also passed. And on the other side, they had found something greater than safety. They had found Jesus. And that made all the difference. Chapter 6. The Village of Questions. The sun was now higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the winding path that led away from the shoreline and into a quiet village nestled among olive trees and wheat fields. As Jesus and his disciples approached, the sounds of daily life grew louder, goats bleating, women drawing water from the well, children laughing and chasing each other through the dust. This was a place untouched by the storm they had just endured. The people here knew nothing of the wind that had howled or the waves that had risen like mountains on the Sea of Galilee just hours before. But they had their own storms, less visible, yet just as powerful. A group of villagers gathered at the edge of the road as the disciples arrived. They had heard of Jesus. Word had traveled from town to town, carried by those who had seen miracles or listened to his strange, stirring stories. The villagers came with sick children in their arms, with questions in their eyes, with hopes quietly clutched to their hearts. One woman stepped forward first. Her hands trembled as she cradled a boy no older than 5, whose eyes were dull with fever. Rabbi, she said, her voice breaking, please. He hasn't spoken in 3 days. He burns with heat. The healer in town said there is nothing more to do. Jesus stepped forward. He gently touched the child's forehead, then looked into the woman's eyes. Do not be afraid, he said softly. He will be well. He turned to Peter and whispered something too low to hear. Peter nodded and opened the pouch he carried at his side. Inside were a few dried figs, given to them by a kind stranger the day before. Jesus broke one in half and placed it into the child's mouth. Give him water, he told the woman, and hold him close. By sundown he will walk. The woman's eyes welled with tears. How can you know? Jesus smiled. Because peace has already come. The disciples watched closely. They were still learning, still trying to understand what it meant to carry peace into the chaos of people's lives. The storm had tested their faith. But this was the test of their compassion. As the day went on, more people came. Some brought their troubles. Some brought food. Others brought nothing but curiosity. Jesus sat under a large fig tree in the center of the village, teaching anyone who wished to listen. He spoke not with authority that demanded obedience, but with warmth that invited hearts to open. His parables poured out like fresh water. There was a man, he began, who built his house on sand. And when the rains came, and the storm rose, the house fell. But another man built his house on rock. The villagers leaned in, nodding slowly. They understood storms. They knew how fragile life could be. His stories resonated in ways deeper than words. James whispered to John, "He's still talking about last night." John nodded. But they don't even know it. Near the tree, a group of children had gathered, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, wide-eyed and giggling. Jesus turned to them and smiled. "Do you know what fear is?" he asked. A little girl raised her hand shyly. "When it's dark and you can't find your mama?" Another boy chimed in. "When there's thunder and I think the roof will fall." Jesus nodded. "Yes, those are storms too. But do you know what trust is?" The children were silent. Jesus continued, "Trust is knowing that even when it's dark, your mama is near. It's believing that the roof won't fall because your house is strong. And it's knowing that God is with you, even when you can't see Him." A small boy scooted closer. "Were you ever scared?" Jesus looked thoughtful for a moment, then answered honestly, "Yes, I have felt fear, but I have never forgotten who my Father is. And that's what gives me peace." The disciples watched in awe. This was not a display of power. It was gentleness, humility, and healing. The very same peace that calmed the sea was now calming human hearts. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip low once more, the woman with the sick boy returned. Her son was walking beside her, his cheeks flushed with health, his eyes bright again. She dropped to her knees before Jesus, clutching his robe. "Thank you. Thank you. You saved him." Jesus lifted her gently by the hands. He was always in God's hands. You only needed to believe. The villagers began to murmur. Some with awe, others with confusion. One man, a merchant with skeptical eyes, stepped forward. "Are you a prophet?" he asked. "Or something more?" Jesus didn't answer directly. He rarely did. Instead, he said, "What do you believe?" The man looked down. I don't know." Jesus laid a hand on the man's shoulder. "Then stay with us. Listen. Watch. Let the storm inside you settle." That night, as the disciples helped the villagers share food, build fires, and care for one another, Peter pulled Jesus aside. "Master," he said, "back on the boat we were terrified. But now I think I understand why you let us go through it." Jesus looked at him, waiting. Peter continued, "If we hadn't faced that storm, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't understand peace. And we couldn't bring it to them." Jesus placed his hand on Peter's shoulder. "Now you begin to see. The storm wasn't just for you. It was for them too." The disciples sat quietly with Jesus, the firelight flickering on their faces. Around them, the village had grown still. Children slept beside mothers, and the sick were breathing easier. Laughter had replaced fear. The storm had passed, not just over the sea, but over their hearts. And the peace that remained was not just calm. It was trust. It was Jesus. Chapter 7. The Journey Beyond the Shore. The next morning, the sun rose softly over the hills, casting golden light across the village rooftops and olive groves. Birds stirred in the trees, and the gentle hum of waking life filled the air. Jesus stood quietly outside the small shelter where he had slept, gazing toward the eastern horizon, where the Sea of Galilee glimmered in the distance. The disciples gathered slowly. Some were stretching, others rubbing sleep from their eyes, but all were changed. There was a quiet attentiveness in the way they looked at Jesus now, not just with wonder, but with deeper understanding. Andrew approached him first. "Master," he said, "they want us to stay." "The villagers. They say we've brought peace here, and that many are coming from other towns to listen." Jesus looked back toward the fig tree where he had taught the day before. More people were already arriving, carrying baskets of food, bringing their children, eager for one more word, one more touch. But Jesus gently shook his head. "The work here is done for now," he said. "We must go where we are needed next. The peace they feel is not something I brought and must keep here. It's something they've discovered within themselves. That is the kind of peace that stays." John, ever thoughtful, nodded. "Like the calm after the storm." Jesus smiled. "Yes, but many still live in the storm, and do not yet know it can be calmed." They gathered their few belongings, thanked the villagers with warm embraces and blessings, and made their way back to the sea. The path felt different now. Not just a road of dust and stone, but a trail marked by purpose. As they walked, Thomas looked around at the dry fields and the clear sky. "Strange," he said. "A few days ago, it felt like the sea would swallow us. Now, it's like it never happened." "It happened," said James quietly. "I still feel it." Jesus turned to them. "Storms pass, but they leave shape behind. Just as the sea smooths stones with its fury, so too can your faith be refined." By midday, they reached the shoreline. The boat they had left behind bobbed gently in the shallows, as if it too had found rest. A few fishermen nearby looked up in surprise to see Jesus and his disciples returning. "Are you heading across again?" one called out. "The waters are calm today." Jesus stepped into the boat first, helping the others climb aboard. He looked up at the clear blue sky, the quiet waves lapping against the wood. "The storm is not always in the sky," he said quietly. "Sometimes it is within." As they set out, the disciples took to their tasks with new steadiness. Peter guided the rudder with confidence. Matthew and Bartholomew adjusted the sails. Even Thomas, once prone to anxiety, sat near the bow with eyes closed, breathing deeply, soaking in the stillness. Halfway across, a gentle breeze picked up, stirring the waters just enough to sway the boat. The disciples tensed, out of habit more than fear, but Jesus remained still, sitting at the center of the vessel, his hands folded. Philip looked at him. "Do you think another storm is coming?" Jesus opened his eyes. "Always," he said. "Storms come, and storms go. But the question is not whether you will face one again. The question is, will you trust me when you do?" The boat rocked slightly, and the memory of the recent tempest came back like a shadow flickering across the surface of their thoughts. But this time, no one panicked. No one cried out. Instead, Peter said, "If you are with us, we will not be afraid." Jesus looked at him and nodded. "Then you are learning what it means to have faith, not just when the sky is blue, but when the sky is dark." They landed near a small, rocky shore, where a narrow path led up into the hills. As they disembarked, a shepherd ran toward them, breathless. "Are you the teacher?" he called. "Please, you must come quickly. There is a man in the caves above who is not right in the head. He screams all day and night. No one dares go near him." The disciples exchanged uneasy glances. "Another storm," murmured Andrew. But Jesus simply said, "Lead the way." As they climbed the rugged path, the shepherd explained in more detail. "He lives among the tombs. Chains couldn't hold him. He breaks them with his hands. He speaks in strange voices, as if there are many inside him. The people fear him. Children won't go near the cliffs anymore." The wind grew stronger as they neared the cave's entrance. Distant shrieks echoed through the rocks. Some disciples slowed their steps. "Do we really have to do this?" asked Matthew, his face pale. Jesus turned to him. "Would you leave him in the storm?" They pressed on. At the mouth of the cave, the man appeared, wild-haired, with eyes that flickered between rage and pain. He bared his teeth, growled, and shouted nonsense at the group. But Jesus stepped forward calmly, meeting the man's gaze. "What is your name?" he asked gently. The man trembled, fell to his knees, and shouted, "We are legion, for we are many." The disciples froze. But Jesus stood tall. "Come out of him," he said, not in anger, but with quiet, absolute authority. What followed was a moment none of them would ever forget. The man let out a cry that echoed through the cliffs. Then a silence. A long, still silence. His body slackened. His breathing calmed. He looked around as if waking from a nightmare. He whispered, "What happened?" Jesus knelt beside him. Peace happened. The man wept. Later, as the disciples helped clean him, fed him, and clothed him, they asked Jesus, "Why did you take us here?" "Why now?" Jesus replied, "Because this was a different kind of storm. Not of wind or waves, but of the mind, of the soul." And they understood. By nightfall, the man was seated beside them, no longer a stranger, no longer a threat. Just a man. A brother. He spoke softly, thanking Jesus again and again, unable to find the right words for what had been done for him. Jesus looked out over the sea, now dark under the stars. "So many storms," he whispered, "but one peace." Chapter 8. Calm within the storm. The stars were bright that night, scattered like tiny lamps across the heavens. The disciples and the once tormented man sat around a small fire at the foot of the hills. No words were spoken for a long time, only the sound of the breeze, the distant call of night birds, and the occasional crackling of the flames. Jesus sat slightly apart from the group, gazing out over the Sea of Galilee. The water shimmered under the moonlight, no longer threatening, no longer dark. Now it looked like a mirror, still and quiet, reflecting the peace that lingered not only in the sky, but in their hearts. After a while, John walked over and sat beside him. "It's strange," he said softly, "how calm everything feels now." Jesus turned to him, a faint smile on his lips. That's what happens when the storm within is calmed. John looked out at the water, thoughtful. "I didn't realize until now how much of the storm was inside us all along." Jesus nodded. "Many fear what's outside, the waves, the winds, the chaos, but the greater battle is often within. Fear, doubt, pride, guilt. These are the tempests that toss the soul." They sat in silence for a moment longer before Jesus said, "Let's return to Galilee in the morning. There is more work to be done." The next day, the group said farewell to the healed man. He begged to follow Jesus, to stay with him and learn more. But Jesus placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "No," he said kindly. "Go home to your people. Tell them what the Lord has done for you. Let your peace speak louder than your past." And so the man went, his head held high, a new purpose lighting his steps. The disciples watched him go, transformed, renewed. The journey back to Galilee was uneventful, but inwardly, the disciples felt different. Their steps were slower, more thoughtful. They spoke less, observed more. Every tree, every bird, every ripple on the water seemed full of new meaning. When they finally reached their hometowns, the familiar noise and bustle of daily life returned, but the memory of the storm remained. Some who heard the story believed it immediately. Others scoffed. "A storm stilled by words? Impossible," they said. "You were just lucky. Storms pass." But the disciples didn't argue. They simply lived differently. They showed more patience, more trust. They feared less. And that was more convincing than any tale they could tell. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills and cast golden rays across the sea, Jesus sat with the disciples once more, this time in a quiet grove near the water. They had just returned from teaching in a nearby village. Peter broke the silence. "Rabbi," he said, "I've been thinking, will we always be safe if we stay close to you?" Jesus looked at him gently. "No," he said, "you will not always feel safe, but you will never be alone. And even in the fiercest storm, you will find me there." Philip asked, "But what if we forget? What if fear overtakes us again?" Jesus replied, "Then remember the boat. Remember the waves. Remember when all seemed lost, and I was still with you. You will forget sometimes, but I will not." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above. And yet, no one flinched. No one looked to the sky with dread. Instead, they smiled, because they had learned something that couldn't be undone. Peace is not the absence of storms. It is the presence of trust. And in every trial ahead, every moment of fear or doubt, they would carry this truth with them, like an anchor in deep waters. As the night deepened and the stars began to fill the sky once more, Jesus said a final word before they rested. "The storm may roar," he said, "but my peace is greater still." And in the stillness of that Galilean night, the lesson was sealed, not only in their memories, but in their hearts. The sea would rage again someday, but they would never be the same.